I was born a century ago, once a jewel, the palace of dreams. I was the pride and joy built by the man known as the Cattle King of Singapore, Muna Kadir Sultan. As I stand witness to history over the last 100 years, for the first time ever, I will unveil the stories that I have guarded in silence for so long. It was quiet that night, the calm before the storm, the bombs in the distance, the sounds of masonry and human bones shattering. For the months that followed, men would come and go. They saw me only as a place of convenience, my beauty long gone. On land, the Imperial Army had crept towards Singapore from Malaya, catching us unawares. In the skies, their bombs descended mercilessly. Innocent men and women were shell-shocked by the onslaught, the once mighty city devastated, engulfed in chaos and desperation. Miraculously, I remained unscathed and prayed for safety. When a group of men arrived, I hoped they were my saviors. How wrong was I? And how wrong is the entire nation to think that the enemy would be defeated?
They were told by the government and also media that Singapore was impregnable. So it was true that the naval base was built in Sembawang and there were gun emplacements put in place, but the Sembawang naval base had no ships. The British strategy was to bring in ships only when they were required. And when they were required, it was really too little, too late. Singapore was defended by troops from New Zealand, Australia, and British, as well as Singapore regiments from the colonial British military here, and the volunteer forces comprising of civilians. These soldiers were really not very well trained and not prepared for real warfare. And the Japanese were very strategic. They came from the north rather than the south, so there was an element of surprise, and the result was devastating, that Singapore fell very, very quickly to a superior force, but a numerically weak force.
The Japanese were swift in their onslaught. They would capture Bukit Timah with ease and made it their command post. Pasir Panjang Ridge was also attacked. Our soldiers fought valiantly, but alas, they fell in what would be known as the Battle of Opium Hill. The 15th of February 1942, the day of reckoning, when the decision to surrender was made. The governor of Singapore faced the unimaginable. Amidst it all, he received a telegram that the nation's water supply was dangerously low. General Arthur Percival then receives a message from the regional commander of the Far East, Sir Archibald Wavell. What broke Percival ultimately was the shortage of water, food, and ammunition supplies. Without these, his men could not persist. Alas, the British garrison in Singapore surrendered unconditionally to General Tomoyuki Yamashita just 1 week after the invasion began.
On 15th February 1942, in the morning at Fort Canning, which is where the Malaya Command headquarters had moved on that day, there was a meeting in the underground bunker that they had created for themselves. At that morning meeting, they took stock of the situation, and they were told, the commanding general, General Percival, was told that the water supply has been cut off. We have water left for like 1 or 2 days. Ammunition of important artillery was running very low. They, of course, already knew that they had no air support. And the Japanese had surrounded them in most parts of the island where the battle was going on. And so they decided that they would surrender.
As chief surveyor, Thomas Kitching oversaw land surveying, conducted research, and managed land records for government projects.
Thomas Kitching was an Englishman, a colonial civil servant. He was the chief surveyor of Singapore. In 1941, he was 52 years old, and he was a diarist. He kept a diary all his life, and as a professional surveyor, he was interested and had a habit of recording details. Thomas Kitching was in the Fullerton building that day, and he stood on the top floors and he observed the situation around him. He said there was heavy bombing and artillery and machine gunning in the area around Fort Canning and the Raffles Hotel, and then in the afternoon along Collier Quay.
15th February. I hear we are surrendering at 4 p.m. If they take over the reservoirs, and I think they have, it will be the end. Our troops are scattered all over the place, just loafing. It's a dreadful sight. Why didn't I go on Nora's boat?
So it was a time of mental anguish for Thomas Kitching too, because his children had left Singapore to safe places way before the fall of Singapore. And a couple of days before Singapore's fall, his wife Nora boarded a ship bound for Australia.
On the 16th of February, after a night of celebration by the Japanese, on that day they decided, now we have suddenly captured Singapore. We were hoping to capture it, but it has fallen into our hands now. There are 1 million civilians in Singapore. The population had almost doubled since the war began from refugees coming from Malaysia, and there were 100,000 Allied soldiers. Amongst the civilians, you had, of course, Europeans, you had Japanese, Chinese, Indians, and Malays. Amongst the soldiers, you had British, Australian, and Indian largely. So they decided different things for different parts of these groups of people.
Thomas Kitching came back to his office at Fullerton Building. He discovered that the Japanese had made an order that all colonial civilians would have to meet the next day and assemble at the Padang at 10:30 in the morning. So he proceeded to pack his bag. The command was that you only could take 10 days worth of clothing, and that everything had to be hand-carried.
Nobody has any idea what we'll be doing or what will be done to us. After early dinner, the department gravitates to my office. They are naturally fed up with things. They will all be prisoners of war, I suppose.
On the morning of 17th February, Kitching went to look for Governor Shenton Thomas because he had heard that essential workers would be exempt from internment. So as chief surveyor, he asked whether he was indeed an essential worker, but unfortunately, he was told that he was not.
His Excellency is very sorry. He doesn't think I'm essential. I should parade with the rest at 10:30, he said. If the Japanese say, why is the chief surveyor essential? I should find it very hard to say why.
So he proceeded to the Padang, and there were lots of people there. And the Japanese said that the children and women would be given transport, but the rest would have to march about the 5 to 8 km to the east coast. The men were first told to report to Duchet police station. So they went there, and the police or the people there didn't know anything about the arrangements, but they were told, go to this place called Karikal Mahal. So that is where they went to.
The records are that in the beginning, there were about 1,700 who collected at the Padang. Later on, the number increased as more and more people got the message.
It was a somber march down the streets. Soldiers guarded sentry points along the way. Those who dared to escape were shown no mercy.
It was through winding, crowded streets of Singapore so that the civilian population could witness the humiliation of the British race, the European race. There were a few recorded events of jeering, but in general, they were not jeered at. The main mood of the civilians was just shock. There was silence. That was the loudest sound that could be heard, silence, because there were thousands of people there watching, thousands of them walking.
They were ordered to form a column and march towards me in the blazing sun, and when they arrived at my doorstep, I imagined that they might have felt a tinge of relief, that their new abode would be that of a seaside palace. They were weary and worn. The stench of death arrived with them, their fate uncertain. They arrived as men of means and some of power, but they would leave forever changed, as much as they would change me. I, once a palace, have now become a prison. Beyond my gates, change reared an ugly face. Singapore was given a Japanese moniker, Seonan. Women and children who had no hand in this war were interned. The Allied soldiers thrown into prison camps around the island. Looters beheaded and their severed heads paraded for all to see.
The choice of Karikal Mahal as an internment camp, the reason for this is speculative, but it makes sense in that there was space to build barracks for a lot of men. You could put in bunk beds and things and house them inside there. Also, it had an open space, so you could have assemblies. It was near the sea, I guess, so you could have fresh air coming through and this kind of a thing. Was never meant to be a permanent camp. I think they started building the facilities up at Changi almost immediately. So it seems like it was meant as a temporary camp.
Kitching describes Karikal Mahal in his diary. This is his first impressions of Karikal Mahal.
We find the place, 5 big houses and a large compound by the sea. There was a mosque tower. The whole place is absolutely bare, dirty, everything smashed to atoms. Very little water. No sanitation, no light. We are the first to arrive.
So they chose a room of 18 square feet and 10 people were housed in that room.
Their complaints about me were endless. I wondered how long I would have to endure these ingrates. But then I realized they too were longing for days past.
So the British really quickly organized themselves according to the normality that they were accustomed to. So they divided the different buildings, and each building had a representative. There was a camp commander. There was even a camp disciplinary committee. They numbered every room, 16 in all, but they left out number 13. They made sure that there was a duty roster, and so everything was in place.
Among the men were a group of men that dressed differently. They looked like seamen.
Suddenly, we heard the scream of diving planes and the explosion of bombs hitting us. I felt the ship shudder, and I felt as if I had been pushed flat on the floor. I knew we had been hit.
It was carrying troops to reinforce Singapore, but those were too little, too late, and the ship was bombed outside Singapore, and there were several hundred survivors among the staff. Fortunately, many of them were stewards who used to help serve food on the ship, and many of them were cooks. So they were very, very useful to the people in Karikal Mahal, because the rest of the men in Karikal Mahal were all civil servants, doctors, journalists, businessmen, many of whom may not have known how to cook. It's a very, very difficult task because they have to feed 700 people every day, and whatever they get is not enough.
18th February. 5 officers will be given passes to go out, and they will get all our food. And that's all we get, unless we work for it by cleaning up Singapore. We must not go outside the compound, i.e. on the beach, except to bathe.
They foraged for food in the first few days by literally just going to abandoned houses, going to shops, some with permission of the shop manager who may have been in Karikal, and other shops that they just found on the way while going around Singapore trying to find anything useful to bring back. They were to build barbed wire outlining the boundaries of the camp.
On the 18th, they had a meeting with the Japanese, and they were told then that they would be interned for the duration of the occupation.
A man arrived one day. The others bowed to him like he was important. Perhaps he was some high-ranking general. A platform was built specially for him to speak to the men, as if he had a concern about the disparity in his height and wanted to appear powerful despite his diminutive form. An angry man who spoke of uncompromising discipline. One must behave or one will be severely punished, he declared, and death awaits those who try to escape. Then one of the men moved a little, perhaps to scratch an itch. But what ensued was a litany of abuse. The general declared that this man had insulted him by moving when he was speaking, that he should be executed. What an atrocity! But then this general, in his full graciousness, changed his mind. Not today, he said, but next time, there will be no mercy. As the days passed, I was overwhelmed by the sheer number of people within my premises. Luckily, they had the decency to move some of their basic needs outside.
Basically, there were 700 people in the camp, they had to organize the entire latrine facility outdoors. There would have been toilets in the buildings, but those could not be used because there was very little water.
One of the things they did was to dig a latrine along the beach. So they were not, as colonial gentlemen, they were not used to that. But keep in mind that, see, in Singapore at that time, bucket system was a very common thing. So really, these privileged gentlemen had to live like the rest of the Asian population.
The only place to go to the bathroom was on this bench, which probably had a great view because you could look out at the Straits and Batam and all of this, but you were sitting right next to the guy on this side of you and the guy here with no privacy whatsoever. And these upper-class European men found this to be very disconcerting, that they would have to, go to the toilet with absolutely no privacy right next to the men next to them.
With very little clean water and 700 people crowded into this small area, there was obviously lack of sanitation. Lack of sanitation led to all sorts of issues, including dysentery and constipation. Many of the people would complain about having to do the latrine in front of other people.
I would watch these men momentarily forget where they were, fantasizing perhaps that they were by the French Riviera. Their daydreaming smashed in an instant, forced into the sea to take quick showers.
Firstly, it was a big shock, the surrender itself just 2 days ago. The second shock was being asked to be interned, because in the war so far in Europe, civilians were not interned. It was only prisoners who were kept in POW camps. The civilians in the countries occupied by Germany and Italy were staying in their homes in most cases. The second was the shock of internment itself.
The 19th of February. We listened to a speech on discipline. Some folk have been found living in a room near the camp. They have been most ferociously beaten up. It will be remarkable if there is no permanent damage. The Commandant says if we behave like gentlemen, we will be treated as such. It is all very, very hard to swallow.
They were men who spoke of petty troubles, and yet kept the deepest pain unspoken. It was a heavy burden to carry, one that has stayed with me through the years. Elsewhere, change was swift. In Farah Park, Malay and Eurasian soldiers were interrogated and forced to pledge their loyalty or meet certain death. Everywhere, the new masters pummeled the people with messages of their superiority, using every medium available. The iconic news rag, the Straits Times, was replaced by the Shonen Times, which would heap praise on even the smallest of the Japanese deeds. The ramshackle state of the country was being cleaned up by internees from around the island. A new normal had begun.
Men of power, reduced to their knees, hands filthy from all the chores they were expected to perform. Scavenging through dirt and rubble for anything useful in order to survive, with sustenance kept at a bare minimum due to the hundreds of mouths to feed. Food was a scarcity. Even pineapple cubes felt like a luxury.
There was an Australian in the camp named Wade, and there was a British-born editor of the Straits Times named Harry Miller, who took it upon themselves to create this newsletter on a typewriter that had been left behind by the Malayan Magic Circle. And they called this the Karikal Chronicles.
How thrilled I was when my previous master's typewriter appeared before my very eyes. I hear those keys clacking away, anticipating the wondrous words they will bring forth.
One morning, I woke up an email alert for the word Singapore from various auctions. And in it, I saw the description of this amazing set of newspapers that were published in Singapore, in Changi jail during the war in the 1940s. And I looked at the description. It seemed like a continuous run of newspapers that were published from 1942 to probably 1945. I discovered that they were not the actual newspapers. They were indeed, in fact, a set of retypes of all the content made by the publishers themselves later on in 1942 while in Changi. Miller was a journalist who works at the Straits Times. Wade was Australian, and he was an insect specialist, and he worked in what was called the Medical Auxiliary Service. The original consists of one long, narrow page, closely typewritten. So the way they used to do it is that they would produce this one long, narrow page and use carbon paper and make 5-6 copies and put one copy on each notice board, the notice board of every prison block. That was their social media in those days.
What special qualities did these men have that, despite their despair, they would deign to start a newspaper? They would not wallow. The Karikal Chronicle would pull them together as a community. It was a way to make the unbearable bearable. I delighted at the clickety-clack of that typewriter. Their strength of spirit was infectious. Just a few sheets of paper, stuck on a wall, and yet it spoke volumes.
They tried to publish on every day, and they describe who was in which block, committee block, and how the organization was done. It talks about the medical staff who were there, who people could go to in case they needed help. It talked about how they could send letters to their wives in the adjacent camp, having a liaison committee to connect with the Japanese to make sure that they get the correct communication from the Japanese about what was required of them. And it stresses that we must make sure that we follow Japanese orders. It talks about the rich Indian merchant coming from India, Karikal in India, which was a small seaside town, and it was a French colony. And he named this seaside villa that he'd built after his hometown. And it talks about how he became rich and how he eventually lost his fortune and family saw tougher times, which is why the villa was in such a dilapidated state. Another interesting story was about the Malayan Magic Circle. They described that probably the strangest bookshelf in the world was the coffin used by the Malayan Magic Circle, which was lying there. And it was used as a bookshelf in the library in Karikal Mahal. They also mentioned that the coffin was used for the most famous trick of the Malayan Magic Circle. It was a body disappearing trick in the coffin. The person who became famous doing this trick, his brother, in fact, was in Karikal, in Block 4, if I'm not mistaken.
And one of the elements of the Karikal Chronicle that they announced would be coming out was what they call Karikal Sample, which would be jokes about camp life, funny anecdotes about camp life, and I think as a way to kind of try to reduce that anxiety. The one that stuck in my head was the joke about not knowing if you have a stomachache or a backache because you'd gotten so thin. And being able to joke about a situation like that, I think, shows a true kind of grit, and it was the grit that kept the British Empire together.
Apparently, many visitors to the sanitary trench on the foreshore find themselves unable to function when there are other Bear Stearns about, and they declare that they will be unable to function normally until some sort of partitions are provided.
Found pinned on door of room 10, house number 4, was, "I have 2 right boots, 8.5. We'll make a swap with anyone who has a spare left one, 8.5. C.S. Burns. Who's the guy who's got 2 left feet?"
We appeal to the minority, and obviously a small minority at that, to pull themselves together and work for the good of the camp by stopping scrounging and grumbling.
Within a few days, darkness would pervade the land. The Japanese yen was now the sole currency. Food was rationed, for which one required food cards. Such humiliation. The people lived in terror as the military police interrogated Chinese men from all over the island, detaining those who were against the Japanese. Once men of distinction and rank, now subjected to thankless tasks, bowing to the enemy, their new masters.
So the contacts with the Japanese soldiers was quite limited in terms of daily interference. However, the main issue in terms of interacting with the Japanese guards was this strange new custom that they were forced to follow from the beginning, which was bowing to them. First few days, there were quite a few instances of issues in this because it comes up in the newspapers quite often that we must follow the Japanese guidelines, must follow Japanese discipline, and it explains to them why bowing is required to a soldier, because they say in the newspaper that the uniform represents the emperor. So you're not bowing to the soldier, you're bowing to the emperor. As you would bow to the British king, you're bowing to the Japanese emperor.
Gone was a sense of humanity. The innocent were seen as mere captives and dispensable. Our shores witnessed men being marched onto its beaches in Pungo, Changi, Katong, Tanah Merah, and Sentosa. It was called Operation Sukching. The Japanese were ordered to kill 50,000 Chinese men. The exact number that perished remains unknown till today.
The Nippons claim they sank the ships which left on February 11th, 12th, and 13th. I hope it is untrue. Nora left on the 13th.
The war is tragic and affects human lives. But for Thomas Kitching, it was, I think, even sadder and more difficult. But unfortunately, Mrs. Kitching, Nora, was indeed a victim of bombing of the ships leaving Singapore Harbour days before the fall of Singapore.
In the still of late nights, the absence of their families rang the loudest for these gentlemen. Although they had no means to restore me to my former glory, I dare say they were the ones that appreciated me the most. To some extent, the freedom within my hallways, the views I provided, somehow cushioned their pain. But even in my dire condition, more and more men arrived at my doorstep.
So on the 25th of February, Kitching records that there were 1,250 people interned in Karikal Mahal. But 2 days later, the number increased to 1,300. So it shows that, increasingly more people were brought into the camps.
Initially, the trickle was accommodated in the existing infrastructure that they had in Karikal Mahal.
The new internees would not share their resources. Scarcity compels human greed indeed. To quell the unrest, the Japanese had to separate the groups. Such foolishness.
The 25th of February. I wonder how long we will be here. I estimate there are 1,250 here now, and 250 in Duchet. Are chances of a swap of internees receding?
March 5th was a very interesting day, as later on, unfortunately, the internees discovered. It dawned as a very normal day. If you look at the issue of Karikal Chronicle on that day, which is issue 13, it was just like the other issues. It talked about what was going on in the camp, some administrative announcements, some information about events in the camp, and a couple of details, about letters to wives, which is something that they were talked about whenever they could. This issue would have been published in the morning like they normally did. Later that afternoon, the Japanese called the camp committee and tell them that tomorrow morning, you are all to move to Changi Prison. And that totally changed their life for the 4th time in 2 weeks after the surrender. And they were given instructions by the Japanese of how this transfer was to happen. They were told that you will all have to walk. They specified that everyone under the age of 63 must walk. And this was probably done specifically to make sure that Governor Shenton walked because he was 63. Otherwise, 63 is a sort of a random number. You'd pick 60 or 65 or 70. Of course, Governor Shenton had to walk the next day all the way to Changi from there. They were told that you carry with you only what you can carry, and you must all be gathered the next morning to start the walk to Changi. The news of the move to Changi would have shattered their state of mind. We have to remember that Karikal Mahal was an open complex. It was not walled. It was, you could see the sea, you could see the sky, you could see greenery around you. When you were to go to Changi Prison, you were enclosed in prison walls, which besides being claustrophobic and uncomfortable, is also psychologically very difficult on the mind of a person. Miller and Wade brought out a 14th and last issue of Karikal Chronicles, which was very hurriedly done. It was a very short one where it just focuses on this announcement of the move to Changi and the details, administrative details about the move.
One of the things that really struck me, and this is not in Gautam's edition, is on the day that they were told to leave, they managed to get out the final edition of Karikal Chronicles, because it was a typewritten newsletter. And in the copy that's held at Oxford, somebody scrawled along the top line, special edition, because they knew it would be the last copy of Karikal Chronicle. And for me, there's a real kind of pluck to that. There's a real kind of energy to it and almost a defiance of the situation they're being put in, that somebody would think to take the time to take a pencil and write that at the top of this, maybe for posterity, maybe to be lost forever. But for me, that's a real kind of a moment of this resistance that's coming from deep within these European men in this set of conditions that they found themselves in.
We will start tomorrow at 10 a.m. under the leadership of ex-Governor Sir Shenton Thomas.
I had just begun to warm to them, and yet again I must bid farewell. As I did with the masters that came before, when they too had only just begun to know me. They left as they arrived, with little fuss, their fears unspoken. And though our acquaintance was but a blink of an eye, I would not soon forget their strength of spirit.
Once they got into Changi Prison, they kept to the way they were organized earlier. So there were 3 men's camps, the Juchiat Prison, Karikal Mahal, and the convent. And there were 3 blocks assigned to them. So they decided to stick with the people they had been with together for the last 16 days. And that's how they remained while in Changi for the rest of their internment. Eventually, they stayed there till May 1944, which was just over 2 years.
Thomas Kitching, unfortunately, did not see the return of the British and the surrender of the Japanese. He died in Changi Prison of cancer on 14th April 1944. He weighed 44 kg. He was buried at Bidadari Cemetery, and when the cemetery was exhumed for public housing, his ashes were transferred to Choa Chu Kang Cemetery, where they now lie.
His death touched me more than I expected. So committed was he to that diary, as if it were a lifeline. How I wished his last days were those of a free man.
He maintained one of the most complete diaries that has survived, and he had used tiny handwriting because he had to keep it in a very small, notebooks. His last diary entry was on 1st April, where he talks about himself being in the hospital and describes the patients around him. And he does not know, probably, of course, that was his last entry.
Kitching's diary was first published in 1998, self-published by his son, Brian Kitching. Only 500 copies were issued. And in 2002, we published a more commercial edition, properly edited and designed, and with a very good index. He dies in Changi Prison. He doesn't know what has happened to his family. To the last moments, he was still clinging to hope that they are alive and safe somewhere.
Through the years, the news of the others found me. Good news that warms my heart. Harry Miller continued his journalism career in Malaysia. Gus Harold Wade moved to Australia. Bill Taylor eventually retired in Canada. They all survived in more ways than one.
This story of Karikal Mahal is really interesting. It only lasted 17 days. This moment of 17 days is worth talking about, from being a civilian to being a prisoner.
No matter how deep and dark one situation may be, there are people who manage to keep their spirits alive in the worst conditions possible, manage to come out of it, manage to help other people keep their spirits alive. They were very brave people.
Over the decades, I have sheltered the most eclectic inhabitants, harbored their ambitions, secrets, and legacies, fanned their passion and bravery, and encouraged their strengths and resilience. Behind my walls, their stories, mysterious yet captivating.
The fact that it was the house of the cattle king, and then it becomes the magic house. This is the magic of Karikal Mahal itself, and that continues. The narrative continues as you move then into the Second World War and what happens to it then. This is why the site itself is interesting, and the site itself has a kind of personality because of those things. It has a tendency to attract the strange.
The world never stops spinning. This, I know, is true. Many years have passed. Decades. Although parts of me now forever lost. swallowed by what is called modernity. But these walls do speak. They remember. How I knew glory as I did infamy, and stardom as I did obscurity. And through it all, I have survived and thrived. Here, I still am.